And of course, personalizing treatment is key. I mean, I mentioned it earlier, but I'll say it again. Clinicians want a full medicine cabinet because they want to provide the right medicine for that patient. And even if medicines are exactly the same structure as in the case of a small molecule, there's still circumstances where maybe the formulation is something you want to be able to vary depending on the nature of that patient. A long dose formulation as opposed to a short one, for example. So these things, you have to keep these all in your consideration when you're choosing medicines. And as I mentioned earlier, again, there's differentiation of that medicine, but also differentiation in the treatment impact on the patient that we cannot fully predict, so we need to be careful for. So this is just a basic argument to say we know this about medicines, that unfortunately there's always this need to be able to allow some variation between the medicines. It's good. It's sometimes actually a core part of the treatment pathway, as in cancer treatments where you actually need to sequence between your treatments to get the right effect. So you need to have choice. It's kind of built into the medical paradigm, and prescribers really need that choice to be available to them so that they can treat as they feel is best for the patient. Now, some of you may be thinking, yes, well, I hear you, and yet I know full well that there are lots of medicines like vaccines that are procured by tender, so why doesn't that cause us problems? Actually, it's a really interesting case. This is a case where you have public health needs that are being addressed often through a tender structure. That's largely because you have a centralized decision-making process, which is also usually linked with funding, where you need to coordinate medicine choice. So you want to have an immunization campaign that's quite coordinated across your population, and that helps to do it. Even so, there's always interesting differences between the vaccines, and this is why it's imperative to have the scientific and medical guidance, who are the folks that really select out which of the vaccines will go forward to the tender and win the tender in the end. It's still a challenge to define like with like. Vaccines have different properties, but this is why science and medicine, medical guidance can be absolutely imperative, and where good procurement involves them in the process quite directly. And likewise, as we'll talk in a minute, the value issues and supply issues are not immaterial. You need to make sure when you're making choices around procurement around medicines that it's not just about the choice as face value, but you're thinking about the wider delivery. So the immunization schedule structures, are they different? Are there supporting services available for campaigns? And critically, what is the production and cold chain deals around those particular vaccines? So it depends on how you define those criteria and why it is really important to get that expert guidance to help define how procurement in these medicines work. So another important thing, and I think this is something I would love to really emphasize with you, so we would love greater competition. So procurement should do a good job of generating effective competition. And in terms of doing that, if you can create tendering terms or procurement terms and procedures that fully encompass value and competition in medicines, it does well for all. So, but we need to remember, it depends on how you define it. So if the treatment is often more than the dose, we need to think about what criteria really give you the full value of that medicines and the services to healthcare. So not just what does the medicine do, but how is it integrated in the healthcare pathway that it's being introduced. So how does that work? What criteria and mechanisms and what sort of outcomes, all or nothing or ranked order, or, is it a group of medicines available? Is it just the one? These need to be, as I said before, developed with your physicians, your patients, your suppliers. Getting input from people who know different parts of the puzzle will really help make sure that the competition delivers the value that people are looking for. And then if we can allow a sufficiently broad choice of medicines within that winning group, we can ensure that patients are treated well and that prescribers can do what they need to do. Recognizing that supply is more than the carton, so by that I mean you don't stop worrying about the supply when the box drops on your table. It's about understanding the criteria of the supplier and supply reliability. Again, which I'm sure you've seen in the news, this is an important issue within medicines, maintaining the assurity of supply. And this is particularly important for biologics because we have very long lead times in production. It's difficult to suddenly ramp up production. It doesn't work in that way. So it needs to be a good assurity of supply. And that's something I know the EMA is even addressing now as a priority interest. And then finally, value is more than the price. What do I mean by that? Its net unit price will actually probably narrow your focus for competition because you're reducing it down to one data point. A better value proposition is to include the wider issues that affect value, and in this respect, looking at most economic advantageous tender terms probably gets you closer to what a fair competitive drive will come from your different suppliers. Because they can really show you what they can do in all these respects. Actually, it should create even greater competition and hopefully greater value for that purchase. Ultimately, if we, again, just use price to look across alternatives for medicines as the principal determinant of how we use them, rather than the therapeutic value of medicines, to patients. The interesting thing to me is that it's completely at odds with the idea of health technology assistance and value-based pricing or value interests. It's quite a contrast. Instead of looking at what that medicine is going to do for therapeutic pathways, you're reducing it down to a single point again on price. So that seems in a way it's a little inconsistent, but it becomes particularly problematic when the choice of alternatives of medicine within that scope really can limit the access for an innovative medicine. So what do I mean by that? Particularly in the case, if you can imagine a generic drug being combined in a selection group with an on-patent drug, and pricing is your only determinant, you are going to be sending a pretty important signal that will weaken that incentive for investment in the future, because you're putting a tricky environment for a new medicine to really be able to compete against what are older vintage products that are off patent and may not be delivering anything like the benefits that new medicine can provide. So these are things that, again, it really matters how you do the procurement, not just if the basic means. So we think that dialogue and negotiation usually delivers great value, and in fact, in some cases, maybe delivering even greater value than tendering per se. It's possible that the only data I found for this is actually in the U.S., and again, it's estimates. It's not necessarily values to be sure, but Forbes did some estimates with with ZS Associates and IMS, where they actually were calculating how much money you were getting off of the cost of the product, off of the medicine, through just contracting and negotiations. And in fact, as the quote says above, these may not be visible to the consumer, but between the insurance company and the pharma company, it's a very efficient and free market. And you're getting sizable discounting values off the medicine with good, effective contracting, good negotiated contracting. And although this is a U.S. example, anecdotally, we have plenty of folks who would be able to give similar quotes across Europe. So this is not unknown in Europe. This is also something very important here. So finally, I'm to conclude, hand over the mic to Jörg. I just wanted to translate these at a first level to what this would mean for a revision in a public procurement directive. So on the issue of like with like, in essence, and an impact for medicine, how does that affect the way we look at public procurement directive terminology and other sorts? The real question is to ask to what extent these procurement methods are applicable to the medicine in concern, particularly biologic and particularly on-patent medicines. So what's the best way to procure them? What are the right terms? And the need to include INN plus name is absolutely mandated for biologics, so that needs to be incorporated within the process. On the question of allowing physicians to choose the right medicine for each patient, we need to allow outcomes for choice. That's particularly important for existing treated patients. For some of our patients, these are chronic treatments. So if they've been on a particular medicine for some period of time, what provision is there going to be to ensure that existing treated patients don't have their medicines switched without good science and medicine justifying that process? And allowing some discretion for practitioners to choose. And any decision around those procurement criteria should be really closely linked and guided by the healthcare practitioners. Treatment is more than the dose. Again, criteria should be developed with those scientific and medical guidance. Where this tendering happens, that's where it works well. If it has good guidance from science and medical teams in the country, and then criteria that look at the impact on healthcare as a whole rather than net price. Supply is more than a carton, then again, the selection criteria on the suppliers, and you could even consider environmental and sustainability criteria, again, as a differentiator. And value more than the price, as I mentioned before, the meet terms could be the really fundamental part of the revision that we're looking at now. That's absolutely imperative for medicines. Finally, the need for negotiation and competitive dialogue. There's no obligation to use tenders for patented medicine. You could use a negotiated procedure instead. We could make use of the competitive dialogue. That's possible. And then finally, we need to think about how we ensure the confidentiality of the offer and the winning terms. Now, that doesn't mean we can't have a very open debate on the process and the procedures. How do we get to those points? But these issues are all part of the commercial things that, again, on those points may not be particular to medicine. That's probably something that our other sectors will share. But that was my, I hope that was a hopefully clear perspective on how medicines are applied within the Public Procurement Directive and in the procurement issues. I appreciate this is a little esoteric a topic for many of you, but I hope if there were any questions, we can get to those, or any points of clarification, I'm happy to answer now, but thank you for your time.